My view of this is that as an actual process working in the world, which creates the concerns that Peter has, it is an economic process. It is an economic driver that, because of the liberalization of markets, because of the falling costs of transport and communications, which is a very long story, we suddenly find that our economies are integrating ever more strongly. Things and decisions that are being taken tens of thousands of kilometers from here are affecting you within a few days. That changes how Mexico can work, how every country works, how people feel about themselves. But at bottom, it's an economic process with profound social and cultural, political, and philosophical consequences. But the driving force, in my view, is economics.
The other interesting aspect of what you were talking about this expansion from the tribal level to the national level and the global level, is that I see that as not so much biological, but something inherent in us as reasoning beings. So if you like, perhaps this is where something somewhat philosophical comes in. But I think that inherent in the capacity to reason is the capacity to expand our horizons, to put ourselves in the situations of others. And this carries ethical significance in that we start to become aware of other beings as like us in relevant ways, and therefore to develop connections with them and to admit them, if you like, to our moral universe. And I think that's become tremendously important as this reach expands for technological reasons, that we have impact on the world as a whole. We can do things in the world as a whole, and it's important that our moral horizon has to expand as well.
Policy can make some countries opt out of the system completely. North Korea is outside the system. Burma is effectively outside the system. These were choices made by these countries, governments, not countries. That would be Peter's view, I think. There was choices made. You can be outside the system, but you pay such a heavy price for being outside the system that over a long period, I think it becomes almost impossible to stay outside. That's what we've seen with China. It's what we've seen with Russia. And that, in that sense, yes, as long as the underlying forces are there, we are going to move in this direction. Policy can halt it, politics can halt it for maybe a generation or two, but I doubt if it will be for longer.
Looking at the examples that Martin mentioned of North Korea and Burma, we may say, well, that's a very bad choice for most of the people in that country, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But there are possibilities, I think, that are not so extreme as that, where countries could make choices to opt out and still maintain a much better kind of society. It would be a different society. Maybe in purely economic terms, the standard of living would not be as high as if they were part of the system, but they may maintain other forms of control over their lives together, over their method of government, over the decisions they make, that they may value. Because we now understand, over the last 10 or 15 years, we've come to the understanding that almost everything we do has an impact on other people. Things that we used to think of as totally innocuous, things like a decision whether to drive a car or walk, or if we do drive a car, whether to have a fuel-efficient hybrid or whether to have a big gas-guzzling thing like a Hummer. Those decisions affect other people, and they affect other people in the most really direct and vital kinds of ways. They will, for example, contribute to sea level rises. That will mean that millions of people in low-lying areas will lose the land that they use to grow their food, or they will contribute to an increased number of dramatic climate events like hurricanes and the fires we just had in Southern California. So we are now responsible for this.
The most important aspect of globalization as a process is that it brings us all together. And the things it brings together are good things, I think, like the transport of ideas, the transport of goods and services we can enjoy, the ability to trade, and also obviously bad things. The growth of markets in illegal products, in drugs, in the trafficking of human beings, in the ease with which diseases are spread across the globe. One of the most beautiful examples, and also horrifying if you think about 9/11, is that it demonstrated very clearly that Afghanistan is bordering on New York. Who before then thought that effectively Afghanistan was bordering on New York? But that is what it was. So everything is exchanged, and because everything is exchanged, we are interacting with one another in a much more intensive way than ever before. Now, if we look at globalization more narrowly and its effects on inequality, and we particularly look at the last 25 years, because this is the period in which globalization has been resurgent, I think the picture is very complicated, but if I were going to summarize it very crudely, it would go something like this. Inequality among households across the globe has almost certainly fallen over this period because of the enormous rises in the relative incomes of very big, relatively poor Asian countries. Inequality in the developed world has almost everywhere increased, and globalization had, I think, a lot to do with it. And inequality in the developing world has very divergent stories, with some very important cases where inequality has clearly increased greatly and where I think globalization was an important part of the story, and other cases where it seems not to have done. India, for example, seems to be a country where inequality has not risen while China has.
It is true, of course, that globalization has benefited many relatively poorer people in countries like China and perhaps more recently in India. And that's a good thing, which I welcome, that it has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it has left the people who are at the bottom, really, the people that Paul Collier in his recent book calls the bottom billion, really more or less at the bottom, without, I think, at the moment anyway, much benefit or advantage coming from globalization. So if we're talking about, let's say, the poorest 10% or 20% of the world's population, they have really not benefited. And in some ways, I think globalization makes it harder for them to actually benefit.